I looked at the windows of the nearby buildings, expecting to see light or movement behind the glass, but they were dark. Everything was still. I walked closer to one of the doors, pressing my hand against the cool glass, peering inside. The shop was empty. No one behind the counter. No customers. Just silence. It was like a dream, a world frozen in time, where I was the only one moving. I moved down the street, faster now, my breath quickening. I turned the corner, passing by the small park where I usually see people jogging or sitting on the benches. It was empty, too. The swings hung motionless in the breeze, and the trees swayed gently as if no one had touched them. I felt the weight of the silence press in on me, each step I took filling the space around me with an unsettling quiet. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cutting through the stillness. My words sounded too loud, too out of place in the empty street. There was no response. No echo, no distant voices. Just the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I continued walking. Something wasn't right. I had to be dreaming, I thought. This couldn't be real. There had to be an explanation. But the longer I walked, the more certain I became that this wasn't a dream. This was real. And I was alone. As I turned another corner, I noticed something that made my heart race. A figure standing in the distance. Someone standing on the steps of a building, just barely visible at the edge of the street. I quickened my pace, eager for a connection, a sign that I wasn't completely alone in this strange world. But as I got closer, the figure didn't move. They didn't turn to face me. They just stood there, still and silent. I called out again, my voice strained, "Hey, are you okay?" The figure didn't respond. I stopped a few feet away from them, unsure what to do next. My hands felt clammy, my heart thudding in my chest as I took in the figure's stillness. I looked at the windows of the nearby buildings, expecting to see light or movement behind the glass, but they were dark. Everything was still. I walked closer to one of the doors, pressing my hand against the cool glass, peering inside. The shop was empty. No one behind the counter. No customers. Just silence. It was like a dream, a world frozen in time, where I was the only one moving. I moved down the street, faster now, my breath quickening. I turned the corner, passing by the small park where I usually see people jogging or sitting on the benches. It was empty, too. The swings hung motionless in the breeze, and the trees swayed gently as if no one had touched them. I felt the weight of the silence press in on me, each step I took filling the space around me with an unsettling quiet. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cutting through the stillness. My words sounded too loud, too out of place in the empty street. There was no response. No echo, no distant voices. Just the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I continued walking. Something wasn't right. I had to be dreaming, I thought. This couldn't be real. There had to be an explanation. But the longer I walked, the more certain I became that this wasn't a dream. This was real. And I was alone. As I turned another corner, I noticed something that made my heart race. A figure standing in the distance. Someone standing on the steps of a building, just barely visible at the edge of the street. I quickened my pace, eager for a connection, a sign that I wasn't completely alone in this strange world. But as I got closer, the figure didn't move. They didn't turn to face me. They just stood there, still and silent. I called out again, my voice strained, "Hey, are you okay?" The figure didn't respond. I stopped a few feet away from them, unsure what to do next. My hands felt clammy, my heart thudding in my chest as I took in the figure's stillness. It was a woman, dressed in a long coat, standing with her back turned toward me. Her hair, dark and flowing, was still as though it were frozen in place. But there was no movement. No sign of life. She wasn't breathing. she wasn't even blinking. I reached out, my fingers brushing against her arm, and the moment I touched her, I felt a strange wave of coldness wash over me. The woman remained completely still, and as I drew my hand back, I noticed something that made my blood run cold, her eyes, wide open, staring ahead, completely unblinking. There was no expression on her face. Nothing. Just the vacant emptiness of her gaze. I took a step back, my breath shallow, my body trembling. What was happening? I couldn't explain it. I couldn't understand it. I had to get out of there. I had to find someone, anyone. I turned and ran, my footsteps pounding against the pavement as I made my way down the street, past the empty storefronts and silent buildings. But as I ran, the feeling only deepened, the feeling that I wasn't just alone in the city. It was as though I had been left behind. As though everyone else had vanished, and I was the last one left to wander the streets, trying to find a way back to something I couldn't quite reach. I didn't stop running until I reached my apartment building. I burst through the door, stumbling inside, my hands shaking as I locked it behind me. The silence inside felt deafening, just as empty as the street outside. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind raced with questions. Was I losing my mind? Was I dreaming? But deep down, I knew the answer. I wasn't dreaming. The silence wasn't just in the street. It was in me too. I sat down on the couch, my head spinning, my heart still pounding in my chest. I didn't know how long I sat there, but when I finally stood up again, I saw it. My reflection in the hallway mirror. And behind me, through the window, I could see it. A crowd of people standing across the street. But they were all asleep. Completely still, just like the woman. And I was the only one who could move. It started as just another restless night. I had been lying awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, watching the faint flicker of moonlight dance across the walls of my bedroom. The world outside was still, quiet, and I couldn't seem to shut off the constant hum in my head. I was tired, no doubt, but my mind wouldn't let me sleep. I turned over, pulling the blankets tighter around me, trying to force my body into rest, but nothing worked. Every time I closed my eyes, the silence of the room seemed to grow louder, more oppressive. At some point, I must have drifted off, but it didn't feel like sleep. It felt more like slipping into another world, one that wasn't quite real. And in that strange, liminal space between waking and dreaming, I saw her. I don't know how I knew it was her. There was something about the way she appeared that made my heart skip a beat, something familiar in the curve of her face and the soft, knowing look in her eyes. She was walking past me, just out of reach, her movements graceful, almost ethereal. She didn't look at me directly, but I could feel her presence, her energy, as if she were walking through my dream like she belonged there, like she was part of the world I couldn't touch. I wanted to speak, to call out to her, but no words came. She walked past me, her figure fading into the soft mist of the dream, her footsteps barely making a sound. I tried to follow, but I couldn't move. I could only watch as she disappeared further into the distance, her silhouette blurring until she was gone, leaving me in the emptiness of my own mind. When I woke up the next morning, the room was bathed in early sunlight, the quiet of the world outside slowly coming to life. My body ached, stiff from the restless night, but there was something else, something lingering in the air. The dream was still with me, like it had left its imprint on my mind. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep, but the image of her, the memory of her presence, stayed with me. It felt real, like she was still there, just beyond the edges of the morning. I tried to brush it off as nothing more than a vivid dream, my mind playing tricks on me in the early hours of the night. But as I went through my usual routine, making coffee, getting dressed, heading out the door, it wouldn't leave me. Her face, her presence, felt too real. I couldn't explain why, but it was as if I had met her before, or as if I was waiting for her to cross my path. The day unfolded like any other. The usual quiet walk to work, the distant chatter of strangers, the hum of the city around me. I moved through the motions, but my mind kept drifting back to the dream. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was supposed to see her again. I hadn't thought much about the idea of fate or coincidence, but that morning, it felt like something was pulling me toward her. And then, just before lunchtime, as I walked down the street near my office, I saw her. She was standing there, just outside a small bookstore I walked by every day. The world seemed to slow as I spotted her across the street. She looked almost exactly the same as in my dream, same soft features, same quiet grace in her movements. She was wearing a light jacket, her hair falling just past her shoulders, and she was staring down at something in her hands, her face peaceful and focused. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. It was her. I couldn't deny it. The same woman from my dream, standing in front of me, in broad daylight. My body felt rooted to the spot, my mind struggling to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. I took a few steps forward, my feet moving almost involuntarily, until I was standing directly across from her. The street was busy, people walking past without a second thought, but to me, it felt like the whole world had narrowed down to just her and me. I wanted to call out, to approach her, but something held me back. She didn't look up, didn't seem to notice me standing there, just a few feet away. She was so close, and yet she felt unreachable, like the dream and the waking world were colliding in that moment, and I wasn't sure which side I was on. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. I wanted to speak to her, ask her if she knew me, if she had seen me in her dreams too. But before I could move, she turned and walked into the bookstore, her figure disappearing behind the door, leaving me standing there, breathless, as if the entire world had just shifted beneath my feet. The next few hours were a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept returning to her, the dream, the way she had walked past me, and then, the way I had seen her standing in front of me, as if time had folded in on itself. I kept telling myself it was just a coincidence, that I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The feeling was too strong, too real, and I couldn't shake the sense that there was more to it than I could understand. When I finally finished work and headed home, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I had to know if it was her, if there was some connection, if this was all just fate or some strange twist of chance. I walked past the bookstore again, my heart in my throat, half expecting to see her standing outside again. But the street was empty, just like every other evening. The bookstore was dark, the door closed for the night. I stood there for a moment, staring at the storefront, wondering if I had imagined it all, wondering if the woman I had seen had really been there or if she was just a figment of my dream, pulled into the waking world for reasons I couldn't explain. And just as I turned to walk away, I caught a glimpse of something in the window. There she was, standing just behind the glass, the same calm expression on her face. She wasn't looking at me this time, but I could see her clearly. She wasn't just in the window. She was inside. And in that moment, I realized that I wasn't the only one who had been waiting for this moment. The world was unfolding in ways I couldn't understand, and it felt like I was only just beginning to see it. I don't remember falling asleep. One moment, I was lying in bed, exhausted from a long day, and the next, I was walking down a street I didn't recognize. It was one of those dreams that felt almost too real, like you were more awake than asleep, as if the world around you wasn't just a product of your mind but a place you had somehow entered. I was standing on a street corner, the air cooler than it should have been for an evening in late spring. The sidewalks were empty, save for a few scattered leaves tumbling across the pavement, carried by a gentle breeze. The buildings around me looked strangely familiar but also not quite right. The storefronts were just a little too dim, the windows reflecting shadows that didn't quite match the light. The streetlights flickered on and off, casting long, stretching shadows across the road, like they were unsure whether or not they should illuminate the world around me. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. There were no people on the street. No sounds. Only the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional creak of an old sign swinging above a door. But something felt off. The street was quiet in a way that was more than just empty. It felt like it was waiting for something. Waiting for me. I started walking, almost instinctively, my footsteps muffled by the quiet. As I moved, I noticed the street signs. The first one caught my attention immediately, Cedar Avenue. I blinked, my heart skipping a beat. Cedar Avenue. That wasn't just some random name. It was the name of the street I grew up on, the one I had walked countless times as a kid. The very street that had been my home for years. I stopped, standing there in the middle of the road, looking up at the sign, my breath catching in my throat. But how was this possible? I was dreaming, right? There was no way this could be Cedar Avenue. And yet, there it was, clear as day. The same name, the same familiar shape of the street corner. I turned around, my eyes scanning the surrounding streets, half expecting the rest of the neighborhood to fall into place, like some kind of déjà vu. And there it was again. The next sign read, Harrison Street. Harrison Street? My mind raced. That was the street where I had spent countless hours with my friends during summer evenings, riding bikes down the long stretch of sidewalk, sharing secrets and laughs. How could this be happening? I looked around again, but nothing in the world around me had changed. The buildings, the shadows, the air, it all felt real. But at the same time, it was as if I was stuck between two places, two versions of reality. I continued walking, my steps faster now, my thoughts swirling. The street signs kept matching the ones I knew so well. Cedar Avenue. Harrison Street. Waverly Drive. I knew these names. I knew them as well as I knew the back of my hand. These weren't just random streets in some dreamlike city, they were streets I had walked every day, lived through, grown up with. And yet, I had never seen them like this before. Not empty, not quiet. Not in this strange, disconnected world where nothing seemed quite real. As I walked, the streets shifted, morphing in subtle ways. The familiar buildings seemed to change as I passed, bending around corners that weren't there a moment before, stretching beyond what I remembered. It was like the city was breathing, shifting in time with my movements. I couldn't make sense of it. I was so sure of the streets I knew, but this place, this world, didn't feel like the one I remembered. It was like it was waiting, like it was unfolding around me, layer by layer. I walked faster, hoping that somehow, I could shake off the confusion. Maybe if I kept moving, I could outrun the strangeness of it. But every turn I made only led me deeper into this dreamlike world, deeper into the streets that were becoming more and more unfamiliar, despite their names being so familiar. The world seemed to twist, like I was walking through a memory that I could no longer hold on to. And then, just as I was beginning to wonder if I had lost myself completely, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Up ahead, a figure was standing in the middle of the street. A woman. Her back was to me, her figure illuminated by the faint glow of a street lamp. She was standing perfectly still, as if waiting for something. I couldn't make out her face, but I knew her. I knew her as clearly as I knew my own reflection. My heart skipped a beat. I called out to her, my voice trembling. "Hey!" But she didn't turn around. She didn't move. Her stillness was unnerving, almost unnatural. The air around her felt thick, heavy, like time itself was caught in her presence. I took a hesitant step forward. "Hey, do you know where we are?" I asked, my voice feeling smaller than it should have. The woman didn't answer. She remained standing, unmoving. But then, in a voice as soft as the wind, she said, "You know this place." I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The words felt like a whisper against the back of my mind, a recognition I couldn't quite grasp. "I know this place." It was like she was speaking the truth I had been avoiding, something I was supposed to understand but hadn't yet. "I don't know," I muttered, my voice shaking. "I don't understand." And then, before I could take another step, before I could ask another question, the woman turned around. Slowly. She didn't rush. Her face was calm, serene, but as her eyes met mine, something in my chest clenched painfully. Her eyes weren't unfamiliar, they were mine. It was me. Standing there, looking back at myself. The world around me shifted again, the edges of reality warping, as if the streets themselves were folding in on themselves, pulling me deeper into this dream I couldn't escape. I looked down at the ground, trying to steady myself, but when I looked up again, the woman, myself, was gone. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding, as the quiet world around me held its breath. And then, slowly, I began to realize. I hadn't just dreamed the street names. I had dreamed my own return. And now, as I walked, I was already a part of the memory. It was one of those dull, gray afternoons, the kind where the world feels like it's stuck in a haze. I'd spent the entire morning at work, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle into my bones. My head throbbed with the pressure of a busy week, and I couldn't wait to get home. The bus ride would be my only reprieve, a moment to rest before heading into the quiet of my apartment. I boarded the bus as usual, the familiar sounds of the engine starting up and the slight jolt as it pulled away from the stop. The seats were mostly empty, save for a few people scattered here and there, each of us lost in our own little worlds. I sat near the window, staring blankly at the passing streets, trying to quiet my restless mind. The hum of the bus, combined with the motion of the road beneath it, quickly lulled me into a sense of comfort. I don't remember exactly when I drifted off. It wasn't sudden. I had simply closed my eyes for a moment, just to rest, and before I knew it, I was asleep. The warmth of the bus, the rhythmic motion, and the soft murmur of the city faded into the background, and I succumbed to the quiet. But when I opened my eyes, everything had changed. The first thing I noticed was the absence of sound. The bus had stopped moving, but there was no hum, no chatter. Just silence. I sat up quickly, my eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. The bus itself was still the same worn seats, same cracked windows, same familiar layout, but everything outside the window was different. The buildings that I had passed 100 times on my route were gone, replaced by rows of structures that looked older, more worn. The street signs were unfamiliar, and the cars on the road had a strange, almost outdated look to them. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if I was still dreaming, but the feeling of being awake was too strong to dismiss. I wasn't in a dream. I was in the past. I stared out the window, my heart beginning to race as the reality of what had happened slowly sank in. The date on the calendar that flashed on the small ad screen in the bus indicated it was still the same day, but the year was not. It was an older year, one I hadn't seen in decades. The city was different, too. It looked like the streets I remembered from my childhood, when things were simpler and the world felt smaller. The cars that passed by were old models, nothing like the ones I was used to. The clothing styles on the people walking along the sidewalk were dated, oversized coats, scarves, and hats that seemed out of place in the current time. I felt my stomach churn. I hadn't even gotten off the bus. I hadn't moved from my seat, and yet I was no longer in the present. I was looking at a version of the world I hadn't seen in years, a version that existed long before I boarded the bus just an hour ago. My breath quickened, panic rising in my chest. I stood up, my legs shaky as I approached the front of the bus, gripping the metal rail for support. I glanced at the driver, but he wasn't who I expected. Instead of the young man who usually drove this route, there was an older man with graying hair, his face stern and weathered. He didn't look at me, his eyes fixed on the street ahead. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaky. What year is it?" He didn't respond immediately, his hands gripping the wheel, his gaze unblinking. After a long moment, he turned slightly, his eyes meeting mine. "It's 1993, he said, his voice flat, almost as though it were a rehearsed response. "Are you all right, miss?" I felt my heart drop into my stomach. 1993? That couldn't be right. I had just been on this bus, heading home, just a few minutes ago, and now I was in the past, almost 30 years in the past. I stumbled back to my seat, my mind spinning. I had to be dreaming. It didn't make sense. How could I have traveled back in time while asleep on the bus? But the more I looked out the window, the more real it all felt. The details were too precise. The people walking along the street, the old storefronts, the way the world felt frozen in time, it was all too real. This was no illusion. I looked around the bus, and for the first time, I noticed the other passengers. They weren't the people I'd seen on the bus earlier that day. Instead, there were men and women in clothes that seemed to belong to another era. The man across from me was wearing a plaid jacket with a flat cap, the woman beside him had a beaded purse hanging from her shoulder, and the young man in the back wore a letterman's jacket. They all seemed unaware of the shift in time. They were living in the present, their present. The doors of the bus opened, and I stepped off shakily onto the sidewalk, my feet landing on the pavement of a world that shouldn't exist anymore. I looked around, trying to find something familiar, something that would tell me this was all some kind of mistake. But it was all the same, the street was the same, but everything had aged, like I had stepped into a time capsule. I started walking, my feet moving on their own, pulling me forward despite the fear gnawing at my insides. I passed the old storefronts, now filled with goods I hadn't seen in years, records, newspapers, and items I only remembered from my childhood. I could almost hear the distant hum of the city from the past, the murmur of voices from another time. I tried to ask people where I was, tried to speak to anyone who might know what had happened, but no one seemed to hear me. The streets were as busy as they had been in the past, but I felt like an outsider, like a ghost walking through a world I wasn't supposed to be in. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A newspaper stand, with a headline that read, "Local teen missing, search underway." It was dated *1993*. The person in the photo on the front page of the paper, it was me. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. How could this be? What was happening? Why was I seeing myself in the newspaper from a time that had come and gone? I didn't know how to answer it, didn't know how to explain the impossible world around me. But I knew one thing. The longer I stayed, the more I realized that this wasn't a dream. This wasn't some figment of my imagination. Somehow, I had woken up in the past. And I had no idea how to get back. It started on an ordinary evening, one of those nights when the world feels heavy with the weight of an unremarkable day. I was alone in my apartment, sitting by the window with a cup of tea in hand, watching the shadows lengthen as the last traces of sunlight disappeared. The city outside was quiet, almost too quiet, and I could feel the pull of exhaustion in my bones. It had been a long week, and sleep seemed like the only thing that could make sense of the chaos in my mind. I'd spent the last few hours trying to wind down, scrolling through my phone, flicking between articles I didn't really care about, and watching videos that barely registered in my mind. My eyelids were heavy, and I could feel the drowsiness creeping in. I knew I should go to bed, but part of me didn't want to let go of the day just yet. I stayed by the window, watching the world slip into darkness, a quiet ache in my chest. That's when she appeared. I didn't hear the door open, didn't see her step into the room. She simply was there, standing in front of me, as though she had been there the whole time. Her presence was quiet, almost serene, but it filled the room in a way that made everything else feel distant, like the air had thickened. I didn't know who she was, but somehow, I knew her. Her face was familiar, yet I couldn't place it. She was dressed in a long coat, her dark hair falling in waves over her shoulders, her eyes looking at me with an intensity that made me feel like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't fully understand. "You're about to fall asleep," she said, her voice soft, like a whisper meant only for me. Her words lingered in the air, carrying a weight I couldn't shake. I blinked, feeling the tension in my body loosen. There was something comforting in her presence, but also unsettling, like she was pulling me into a space that didn't quite belong. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask who she was or what she wanted, but before I could, she spoke again. "Don't sleep," she said, more firmly this time. "You must stay awake. Whatever you do, don't fall asleep." Her eyes held mine, and the words she spoke felt too important, too urgent for me to ignore. I couldn't explain why, but a strange, cold shiver ran down my spine. Something in the air around me seemed to change, as if the room itself had shifted in that moment. But my body felt heavy, too heavy to move. I could feel the pull of sleep in my limbs, the gentle weight of my eyelids growing impossibly hard to keep open. The warm tea in my hand had cooled, forgotten on the table beside me, as my mind began to cloud over with drowsiness. "I'm already dreaming," I muttered, my voice sounding far away even to my own ears. She didn't respond immediately, just stared at me with those piercing eyes, her face unreadable. And then, as if sensing something in my words, she stepped closer, her presence filling the space around me. "No," she whispered urgently, her hand reaching out as if to steady me. "You're not dreaming. You've crossed over. You're already there. But you mustn't fall deeper. If you do, you may not come back." Her words didn't make sense. They didn't feel like they should be real, but in that moment, they felt more real than anything else. I tried to speak again, but my words were slipping away, my mind growing hazy. The weight of my own body seemed to dissolve, and my vision began to blur. The room around me was fading, sinking into the edges of darkness. And then, just as I thought I might fall into the depths of sleep, I woke up. Except I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I was standing in the middle of a dimly lit street, the sky above me dark and empty, a soft mist clinging to the ground. The city was eerily quiet, like a world frozen in time. The air felt too still, as though it had been holding its breath for years. I took a slow step forward, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what was happening. Where was I? What was going on? And then I saw her again. She was standing at the end of the street, her back to me, staring out into the distance. Her long coat fluttered slightly in the wind, and I could feel her presence even before she turned around. When she did, her eyes met mine, and I froze. It was her. It was the same woman who had been in my apartment just moments before. The same urgency in her gaze, the same quiet intensity. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly, her voice carrying across the silent street. "You weren't supposed to fall asleep. But now you're here, and it's too late. You've crossed into the space between, and once you're here, it's harder to leave." I wanted to speak, to ask her what she meant, but my body felt numb. My limbs refused to move, as if the air itself was holding me in place. I couldn't breathe right, couldn't think straight. The fog of sleep still clung to my mind, clouding my thoughts. "Don't fall asleep again," she whispered, stepping closer. "If you do, you'll stay here. Forever." Her words struck me with a force I couldn't explain, and I tried to step back, but my body wouldn't listen. I felt myself sinking, like the ground beneath me was giving way, like I was falling through the very fabric of the world itself. The street, the fog, everything around me seemed to warp and bend, as if it were all a dream. Her voice echoed in the distance, a fading whisper that I couldn't quite catch. "Stay awake," she said, her voice growing fainter. "Stay with me. Stay awake." And then everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I was back in my apartment. The room was dim, just as I had left it, the same cup of tea cooling beside me. I was sitting in the chair, my body rigid with the aftershock of what had just happened. My heart was racing, my breath shallow, and the air around me felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. I glanced around the room, looking for some sign that I hadn't imagined it, asterisk or asterisk, the street, the mist. But everything was normal. It was the same as it had been before I fell asleep. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, the faint hum of the city outside drifting in through the window. But something had changed. I couldn't explain it. I didn't know how, but I knew I had crossed into something else. The space between, the place she had warned me about. I had dreamed of it, and now, I had woken up from it. Or had I? I didn't dare close my eyes again. I stepped off the bus and onto the street, but something was immediately off. The air felt too still, the kind of silence that sinks deep into your bones, pressing against your chest with a weight that didn't belong. The city around me should have been alive with noise, the distant hum of traffic, the shuffling footsteps of pedestrians, the chatter of people on their way to and from wherever they were going. But there was none of that. It was silent, unnervingly so, like the entire city had been paused, suspended in time. I stood at the bus stop for a moment, looking around, trying to piece things together. The buildings were familiar. The same shops, the same street corners, the same towering skyscrapers I had walked past 100 times. It looked like the city I knew, the one I'd lived in for years. But something about it felt wrong. The streets were empty. No cars whizzing by, no bikes weaving through the lanes, no people rushing to catch the next bus. It was too quiet, too still. I took a step forward, feeling a strange heaviness in my legs, like the weight of the silence was dragging me down. I glanced at the nearby park, usually bustling with joggers, kids running around, and people sitting on benches, chatting or reading. But today, there was no one. Not a single person in sight. The benches were empty, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling softly, but even that sound felt too quiet, as if it was too careful not to break the silence. I walked down the sidewalk, my footsteps louder than they should have been, the sound of my shoes clicking against the pavement filling the empty air. I passed the corner cafe where I usually stopped for a coffee in the mornings, but the door was shut, the lights inside dim. I peered through the window, but the inside was dark, untouched. The chairs and tables were arranged exactly as they had been the day before, but there was no sign of life. No barista, no customers, not even the faint sound of the coffee machine whirring away. Just emptiness. The further I walked, the more I noticed the absence of life, the absence of sound. The whole city felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something, for anything to happen. It wasn't like the quiet of a sleepy morning or the calm of a late-night walk. It was different. It was as if the city had been abandoned, as though someone had pressed pause, and I was the only one still moving. I crossed the street, my eyes darting from building to building, searching for something to explain the stillness. I noticed the familiar store signs, the cafes, the shops, but everything looked too pristine, too untouched, like they hadn't been used in days, weeks. The windows were spotless, the pavement clean, the air, too still. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me, wrapping around me like a thick fog, suffocating me, pulling at my breath. I looked around again, my eyes scanning the street for any sign of life. But there was nothing. No cars parked on the curb, no people walking by, no stray dog trotting down the street. Just an eerie emptiness that felt so unnatural, so wrong. I stepped into a small convenience store on the corner, hoping to find some semblance of normalcy, hoping the quiet hadn't seeped in here, too. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, the familiar sound breaking the heavy silence around me. But when I looked around the store, I was met with the same emptiness. The shelves were stocked with goods, the floor clean, but there was no one behind the counter. No cashier. No customers. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the back corner, and the soft rustle of a magazine flipping over on its own. I walked up to the counter, my steps slow, cautious, as if I were afraid that any sudden movement might shatter the fragile calm around me. I pressed the bell on the counter, the sound loud in the stillness. But no one came. The store remained silent, as if time itself had stopped. I turned around and left, stepping back into the street, my heart beginning to race. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of it all. I wasn't imagining it. The city was empty, and it was too quiet to be real. I started walking again, faster this time, trying to get to somewhere, anywhere that might give me a clue about what was happening. I passed a few more empty shops, all perfectly arranged, untouched, but lifeless. I walked past a park bench, a lonely paper cup resting on the seat, forgotten. I looked up at the sky, hoping for something familiar, something that would tell me everything was fine. But even the sky was different, too still, too gray. The clouds hung low, as if they were waiting for something to happen. And then, as I turned a corner, I saw it. A person. Just one. They were standing in the middle of the street, frozen in place, looking down at the ground. They weren't moving. They weren't walking, talking, or even acknowledging the world around them. They were standing as still as everything else, a part of the strange, unbroken silence. I stopped in my tracks, my eyes fixed on them, unsure of what to do. Should I approach? Should I speak to them? But before I could move, the figure slowly turned and walked away, their steps as slow and deliberate as everything else in this silent city. I stood there, watching them disappear into the distance, and a shiver ran through me. I didn't follow them. I couldn't. Something about it felt wrong. The stillness, the emptiness, it was like the city was on the edge of something, but I didn't know what. I didn't want to find out. I turned back, walking faster now, as though the street itself might swallow me up if I didn't keep moving. The world around me seemed to grow quieter with each step, the silence deeper, more suffocating. I was no longer sure if I was dreaming or awake. The city looked familiar, but it didn't feel real. And no matter how fast I walked, no matter where I turned, I couldn't escape the strange, oppressive quiet that clung to everything. The city wasn't empty. It was waiting. And I was the only one left to see it. I don't usually remember my dreams. Most nights, I drift off to sleep and wake up the next morning with only a vague sense of having been somewhere, having experienced something, but nothing concrete. The details always slip away as the day begins, like sand through my fingers. But this one dream, this dream stayed with me. It started simply enough. I was in a cafe, one I didn't recognize. The kind of place that's comfortable without being overly familiar. The walls were warm shades of deep brown and gold, the soft hum of quiet chatter blending with the clink of cups and plates. The air smelled faintly of fresh coffee and pastries, rich and comforting. I sat by the window, looking out at the streets of a city I couldn't quite place. The streets weren't busy, just a few people strolling by, lost in their own thoughts. It was peaceful, the kind of place that made you feel like time could slow down and no one would mind. I wasn't alone in the cafe. There were a few other people around, but no one too close. At the counter, a woman was preparing coffee, her movements fluid, as if she had done this 1,000 times. The sound of the steam rising from the machine was calming, like it was part of the rhythm of the world. I watched her for a moment, not in a way that felt intrusive, but more like I was observing a moment I didn't belong to. I hadn't noticed the person sitting at the table next to me until I turned to grab my cup. They were sitting quietly, reading a book, their face partially obscured by the pages. Their presence felt familiar somehow, but I couldn't put my finger on it. There was something about their calmness, their stillness, that was almost hypnotic. I watched them for a moment, wondering if I should say something, but the moment passed. It didn't matter. We were both just two souls in the same place, two strangers in a shared space. The dream continued in a hazy, comforting way. The light outside dimmed as evening approached, the city growing quieter. It was one of those dreams that felt like it could go on forever, no conflict, no urgency, just an unfolding moment of serenity. And then, I woke up. The dream faded quickly, but for some reason, it stayed in the back of my mind throughout the day. I couldn't shake the feeling that the cafe I had dreamed of wasn't just something my mind had made up. It felt like something I had known, something I had visited before, even though I couldn't remember it from my waking life. The next day, I went about my usual routine, the day passing in its usual haze. But then, as I walked down the street toward my usual coffee shop, I passed a small cafe tucked in a corner of the block, one I had never noticed before. The sight of it stopped me in my tracks. It was the cafe from my dream. The same warm colors on the walls, the same soft lighting, the same comforting scent of coffee and pastries in the air. It was as if the dream had spilled over into the real world, pulling me toward it. I stood there for a long moment, just staring at the cafe, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't explain why, but the sense of déjà vu was overwhelming. This place. I had seen it before, been here before, even though I had never set foot inside. I stepped closer, my hand hovering over the door handle. There was a strange pull inside me, a feeling that I couldn't quite ignore. I opened the door slowly, the soft bell above it chiming as I entered. The warmth inside was immediate, the air rich with the scent of freshly brewed coffee. I felt a sense of calm wash over me, like stepping into a space that I was meant to be in. It was the same as it had been in my dream, yet somehow more real, more solid. I walked up to the counter, feeling a strange familiarity with the barista behind it. She smiled at me, just like she had in my dream, and began to prepare a coffee without a word. I watched her for a moment, as if I were watching someone who already knew what I needed, without me having to say a thing. I sat by the window, just like in my dream. The same spot. The same view of the street outside, empty and quiet. There was the same soft hum of conversation around me, the same gentle clinking of cups. The world felt slow here, in a way that I had never experienced before. As I sipped my coffee, I wondered if I had somehow wandered into a place that existed somewhere between dreams and reality, a place where time bent and things felt meant. And then, just like in my dream, the person sitting next to me looked up from their book. It was the same figure, the same calm presence. Their face, just as I had remembered, partially obscured by the pages. They didn't seem surprised to see me, didn't seem to notice how strange this whole situation was. They just smiled, a soft, knowing smile, as if they had been waiting for me all along. I couldn't speak. I didn't need to. The moment felt too perfect for words. I finished my coffee, paid at the counter, and left the cafe. But as I stepped back onto the street, I couldn't shake the feeling that this place wasn't just something I had dreamed. It was real. And somehow, it had been waiting for me. And as I walked away, I realized something else. I didn't need to understand why it felt so familiar. I didn't need to know how I had found it. I just knew that, for some reason, I was meant to walk into that cafe, not just in a dream, but in this world too. Somehow, the dream had led me here. And it felt like I had been here before. The night had fallen quietly, and the city seemed to be holding its breath. It wasn't a particularly special night, just the usual damp, cool air that came with autumn settling in. I was walking home from work, the streets more empty than usual, my footsteps echoing slightly in the stillness. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting patches of pale light on the pavement, creating a comforting rhythm as I moved through the quiet. As I walked, I noticed her. She was standing just beneath one of the streetlights ahead of me, her figure outlined by the glow of the light. At first, she seemed like just another stranger, someone waiting for something, perhaps a late bus or a friend. She stood perfectly still, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, her head slightly tilted downward as if lost in thought. But as I drew closer, something began to bother me. The streetlight above her flickered for a moment, casting a brief shadow over her. And when the light steadied again, I realized something strange, the light wasn't reaching her. She was standing directly beneath it, yet the pool of light seemed to stop just short of her, as if some invisible force were keeping the light from touching her. The area around her was bathed in the usual pale glow, but where she stood, right at the center of it, there was only darkness. I stopped in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. The shadows around her were sharp, unnatural, almost as if they were actively avoiding her. I blinked, confused, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was an odd trick of the light, some malfunction in the street lamp. But no, I was sure. The shadows moved around her, never touching her, as if there was an unseen barrier between her and the light. A chill crept up my spine, and I felt a strange pull toward her, something inexplicable urging me to keep walking. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That whatever was happening in that patch of darkness wasn't something I should approach. I hesitated, my feet rooted to the pavement, my breath coming a little faster now. She didn't seem to notice me, or at least she didn't acknowledge my presence. Her stillness, her unblinking gaze, though I couldn't see her face clearly from this distance, was unsettling. She wasn't looking at anything, just standing, motionless, beneath that cold, unyielding halo of light that never seemed to touch her. I forced myself to move forward, each step feeling heavier, as though I were walking through a dense fog. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I could feel the air around me shift, the world feeling a little too quiet, a little too still, as if even the city itself were holding its breath. When I reached the edge of the light, I could no longer resist the urge to look back at her. She hadn't moved, still standing beneath the streetlight, but the darkness surrounding her seemed to have deepened, growing almost unnatural. The light above her flickered again, casting strange, jagged shadows that stretched unnaturally across the street. I took another step, but then, just before I crossed into the next patch of light, I heard something. A faint whisper. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't directed at me, but it was there. A voice, soft and indistinct, coming from her direction. "Don't come closer," the voice seemed to say. It wasn't a warning, not really. It was more like a command, gentle but firm, like a breeze brushing past my ear. The words didn't feel like they belonged in the world I knew. I stood there for a moment, frozen, staring at the woman beneath the streetlight. And in that instant, I realized something that sent a shiver down my spine. She wasn't just standing there. She was waiting. Waiting for something, or someone. My heart pounded in my chest as I forced myself to take another step. I couldn't help it. My body seemed to move against my better judgment, compelled by something I couldn't understand. I kept my eyes on her, even as the light above me flickered again, casting erratic, dancing shadows across the street. And then, in the corner of my vision, I saw it. A shadow. Not the shadow of the woman, but something else, something darker, something that moved just beyond the light, creeping along the edges of the street. It was so faint, so quick, that I almost didn't see it at all, but when I did, my breath caught in my throat. The shadow wasn't like the others. It wasn't merely the absence of light. It was something else. It had form, something vaguely human, but twisted, indistinct, its edges curling in on themselves, as if it were fighting against the light that tried to reveal it. I turned quickly, panic rising in my chest. I had to leave, I had to get away. But when I looked back at her, she was gone. The spot where she had been standing, under the streetlight, was empty. The darkness around the light remained, thick and oppressive, but she was no longer there. I stood in the middle of the street, my pulse racing, trying to process what had just happened. The shadows in the distance felt heavier now, darker. I turned and walked away, each step quickening as I felt the pull of something behind me, something just out of sight, watching from the corners of my vision. I didn't look back. When I reached home, the night seemed quieter than before. The silence of the city outside felt almost unnatural now, like the air had thickened, like something had changed. I locked the door behind me, my hands shaking. I stood in the hallway for a moment, trying to shake the unease that clung to me like a shadow. I didn't see the woman again. Not that night. Not the next day. But every time I walk down that street, I can feel the pull of the darkness around the streetlight, the weight of the space where she had stood, waiting. And sometimes, when I'm alone, in the quiet of the night, I can still hear that whisper. Don't come closer. I don't remember falling asleep. One moment, I was lying in bed, too tired to think straight, and the next, I was somewhere else. The world around me felt distant, distorted, like a fog had settled in my mind. I was on a street, though it wasn't one I recognized. The pavement beneath me felt too smooth, too perfect, and the air was cool, but it had a strange heaviness to it. It was like stepping into a world that was familiar and yet completely foreign at the same time. The kind of place you can never quite place, no matter how hard you try. I started walking, my feet moving almost of their own accord, each step heavier than the last, as though the ground itself were pulling me deeper into this strange reality. The city around me looked just like any other city, towering buildings, flickering streetlights, empty storefronts with dim lights casting long shadows on the sidewalk. There was a low hum in the air, the sound of distant traffic, but no one else was around. It was a city without people. As I walked, I began to notice something strange. The street signs, every street sign, was blank. Just a few letters faded in the distance, but nothing concrete. I looked at the buildings, trying to make sense of them, but the more I looked, the more disjointed they seemed. Some were too tall, some too short, and none of them felt quite right. I couldn't focus on any one thing for too long without it shifting just a little, like the world was being held together by the thinnest thread. But the most striking thing was the billboard. It loomed above me, a massive, glowing screen that stretched across the side of one of the buildings. I had been walking for what felt like hours, but it hadn't registered until now. This was the first thing in the city that didn't feel wrong. The lights on the billboard flickered slightly, and for a moment, I thought it might have been malfunctioning. The glow illuminated the street around me, casting long shadows on the pavement. I stepped closer, trying to read the message. It was a jumbled mix of colors and shapes, too blurry at first to make out, but as I stared, the words began to sharpen, becoming clear with every passing second. And then, they formed into a single phrase, a simple, chilling sentence that made my heart skip a beat. Wake up. I froze. The words were clear and crisp, glowing brightly against the darkened background of the street. They seemed to pulse, like they were alive, like they were vibrating with some kind of urgency. I didn't know why, but the more I stared at them, the more I felt like I was trapped in a dream, trapped in a world where nothing made sense and everything was trying to wake me up, wake me up from something I didn't even understand. I tried to look away, to move on, to make sense of this strange place, but the words on the billboard held me in place. There was something about the way they shimmered, something that felt too real, too pressing. I could almost hear the echo of them in my mind, repeating themselves over and over like a mantra. Wake up. Wake up. I turned around, desperate to escape the intensity of the message, but the street around me seemed to stretch on forever. The same tall buildings, the same empty streetlights, and no sign of life. It was like I was stuck in a loop, walking down the same path, unable to get away from the billboard, from the message, from the voice inside my head telling me to wake up. I blinked, hoping to snap myself out of it, but nothing changed. The words on the billboard were still there, glowing bright, waiting for me to understand something I couldn't quite grasp. The strange unease in my chest grew, a deep, gnawing feeling that I couldn't shake. I had to wake up. That was the only thing that mattered now. But where was I, and why couldn't I remember how I had gotten here? The air grew heavier, the hum of the city growing louder in my ears. I could feel the world shifting around me, bending in strange ways, the buildings warping and twisting like they were made of rubber, too elastic to hold still. The lights on the billboard flickered again, faster this time, almost like they were short-circuiting, the glow becoming erratic, strobing in and out. I stumbled backward, my mind spinning. The message was too much, too urgent. It wasn't just a sign anymore. It felt like it was talking to me, reaching through the screen, demanding something from me that I couldn't give. Wake up, it repeated again, and this time, the voice wasn't just in my mind. It echoed through the air, around me, reverberating in my chest. The sound was suffocating, as if the entire world was pressing down on me, urging me to break free, to wake up from whatever this was. But no matter how much I tried to move, I couldn't break away. The world seemed to ripple, the edges blurring, like I was slipping between two worlds, the dream and reality, and I had no idea which was which anymore. And then, I felt it. The sudden pull of gravity shifting, the sensation of everything snapping back into place. I gasped, my eyes flying open, and for a moment, I was convinced I had woken up. I was back in my apartment, the soft light of the early morning coming through the window. The room was familiar, the sound of the street outside drifting through the air. I sat up quickly, my heart pounding, my breath shallow as I looked around. I was awake. I had to be awake. The dream was over. The world was real again. But then, I glanced toward the window. And I saw it. The billboard, glowing in the distance, just beyond my window. It wasn't a dream. It was waiting for me. It started like any other dream, the kind that begins with a dull sense of familiarity, as if you've walked this path before, but don't quite remember when. I found myself in the city, but it wasn't my city. It was familiar in the way old memories are, fragments of places I had once known, yet distorted, stretched in odd directions, like they were just a little out of place. The streets were wide and empty, the buildings looming above me, their windows dark and hollow. It felt like I was standing in the middle of something unfinished, something that hadn't quite been put together yet. I started walking. The city felt wrong. It was quiet, too quiet for a place that should have been bustling with life. There were no people, no sounds except for the faint echoes of my footsteps, bouncing off the empty walls. It was as though the city was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The sky overhead was a pale, unremarkable shade of gray, the air heavy, as if the entire world was submerged beneath a thick veil. As I walked, the city around me seemed to stretch on forever, the streets bending and twisting in ways they shouldn't. I turned corners I didn't remember, and somehow, I ended up in places I hadn't planned to go. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I saw the same buildings, the same empty streets, stretching out behind me in an endless loop. I could feel myself getting lost, and no matter how far I walked, I couldn't find an exit, a way out. It was when I tried to leave the city that things took a darker turn. I reached the edge of the city, where the buildings began to thin out, and the streets became overgrown with weeds and tangled vines. The air felt heavier here, like I was crossing some invisible boundary. I thought I saw a faint light in the distance, maybe the edge of the city, maybe the horizon, but as I walked toward it, the light never seemed to get closer. It remained just out of reach, always ahead of me, always a little farther away. I quickened my pace, my heart beating faster, the feeling of being watched creeping over me. The quiet was unbearable now, the stillness pressing in from all sides. I felt the urge to run, to break free from this place that seemed to stretch endlessly. But no matter how fast I moved, the city never let me go. The streets looped back on themselves, the path forward only led to more streets, more buildings. The farther I went, the more lost I became. I stopped, panting, my breath shallow as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The air around me was thick now, oppressive, like the city was closing in on me. I turned around, expecting to see the same empty streets behind me, but instead, I saw a figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, the shadow of a building falling in an odd way. But no. There was someone standing in the distance, just beyond the flickering street lamp. I couldn't make out their face, but I could feel their presence, like they were waiting for me to move. I stared at them for a long moment, and just as I started to take a step toward them, they moved. It was slow at first, almost like they were walking toward me with a deliberate calmness, as though they knew something I didn't. I couldn't explain it, but the air around me seemed to change with every step they took. The closer they got, the more the world around me began to shift, the buildings bending just a little, the streets warping in strange ways, like the entire city was beginning to breathe, to move. I turned away, a cold dread rising in my chest. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. I had to find my way out. But when I turned to walk back the way I came, I found that the streets had changed. The path was gone, replaced by buildings that hadn't been there before. The city had shifted while I wasn't looking, like it was reshaping itself, adjusting to keep me trapped inside. I tried to call out, but my voice felt muffled, as if the city itself was swallowing my words before they could escape. I pressed my hands to my temples, my thoughts spinning faster and faster, trying to piece together something that made sense, but the city wouldn't let me. The figure, still out of sight but now ever present, seemed to be following me, or maybe it was the city itself, pulling me back, making sure I stayed in place. I couldn't leave. I turned again, desperate to find something familiar, something that might break this pattern, but the streets had changed yet again. I recognized nothing. I was no longer sure which direction I had come from, or where I was going. The city was its own labyrinth now, a world shifting around me, trapping me within it. I was part of it now, like I had always been. The figure appeared again, closer this time, standing just beyond the shadow of a building, its face still hidden. But there was something in the way they stood that sent a chill through my spine. I was being drawn toward them, helplessly. The city wasn't just a place anymore, it was a force, pulling at me, holding me in its grasp, and the figure was a part of it, an extension of something bigger. I reached out, instinctively, as though I could touch something solid, something real, but when my hand touched the street, it felt soft, like I was sinking into it, like the world was swallowing me whole. And that's when I realized it. I wasn't inside the city anymore. The city had become me. And no matter how hard I tried to leave, no matter how fast I ran or how far I walked, the city wouldn't let me go. Because it was part of me now, part of the dream that I couldn't wake from. I wasn't just lost in it. I was the city. And it would never let me wake up. I woke up with the soft warmth of sunlight filtering through the blinds, the quiet hum of the morning filling the room. I stretched, still half lost in the fading remnants of a dream, the edges of it just slipping out of my grasp. It was the kind of dream that lingers, vivid, real, even after you've opened your eyes. But no matter how hard I tried to remember the details, it was already slipping away, like sand through my fingers. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake off the drowsiness. The day was just beginning, and I had a long list of things to do. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different, something had changed. It wasn't a sense of dread, but more like something had shifted, just out of sight, like the air around me was holding its breath. I stood up, moving toward the window, letting the light wash over me. The world outside seemed unchanged, quiet, the usual morning sounds of cars passing by, birds singing in the trees. But as I stood there, staring out into the street, I heard it. A whisper. It was soft, too soft to be coming from anywhere near me. It wasn't a voice from the outside world. It was closer. More intimate. Like it was coming from inside my head. It's time, the whisper said. A voice that wasn't mine, but still familiar. My name, soft and breathy, echoed in my mind like a distant call. I froze, my breath catching in my chest. My name. It had been spoken in the same way it had been in the dream. A quiet, soothing voice that made me feel known. I couldn't explain it, but the whisper felt like something that was waiting for me, something I had heard before. I spun around, looking for the source, but the room was empty. There was no one behind me, no one in the corner, no shadow lingering in the dim light. The room was still, exactly as it should be, and yet, the whisper lingered. It was real. I walked back to the bed, my mind racing. The voice in my dream had sounded so familiar, so warm, but now it felt like it was more than just a memory. It was here. In this room. In this world. I could still hear the echo of it, soft and undeniable, in my ears. I tried to push it aside, shaking my head as if I could shake off the feeling of being watched, but I couldn't. The whisper was still there, lingering at the edges of my consciousness. It wasn't just in my head, not anymore. It was real. The dream had felt like a strange dream, a dream where I stood in a darkened hallway, the air heavy with the scent of rain, the walls closing in around me. The voice had come from the shadows, calling my name softly, urging me forward. I had walked down the hallway, pulled by the sound of that voice, a voice I had somehow known, though I couldn't remember its face. It had felt so real. And now, that same voice, that same whisper, was in my waking world. I shook my head again, trying to ground myself, trying to focus on the world outside my window. But every time I tried to push the thought away, it came back, louder. My name, the voice calling me, drawing me in. The weight of it pressed down on my chest, like a door that had been closed, now slowly creaking open. I reached for my phone, trying to distract myself. I needed something normal, something to pull me out of this haze. I unlocked the screen, my fingers trembling slightly, and began scrolling through messages, emails, anything to force my mind to focus. But the feeling didn't fade. I felt it like a presence behind me, a shadow just out of reach, watching, waiting. And then, the whisper came again. Asterisk, you know where to go. Asterisk, it wasn't just a voice anymore. It was insistent, pulling at me with a purpose, a certainty that I couldn't ignore. I could almost see the path it was leading me toward, but it was blurry, obscured by a fog I couldn't push through. I stood up, my feet moving without my permission. I didn't want to listen to it, didn't want to follow the strange call that seemed to be growing louder in my head. But my body moved on its own, like it knew something I didn't. It carried me forward, toward the door, toward something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. The hallway outside my room was silent, too silent, like the whole world was holding its breath. I walked down it, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath shallow. The whispering was growing louder, sharper, urging me forward with a sense of urgency. I reached the door. I knew what was on the other side. I couldn't explain it, but I knew. The voice was pulling me toward it, toward something that had been waiting for me, something that was no longer just a dream. It was real. The voice wasn't just a memory. It was calling me to something I couldn't name. My hand hovered over the door handle, my mind racing, my pulse quickening. But when I opened the door, everything changed. The hallway beyond it was no longer the one I had walked down. The walls had shifted. The air was thick with a strange, almost tangible energy. The floor was uneven, the lighting flickering. The world outside didn't feel right. It felt like something was waiting for me, something I had been drawn to, something I had to face. I stepped into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind me, and the whisper came again, but this time, it wasn't just in my head. Asterisk, you're here. Asterisk, I turned around, but there was no one. Just the shadows in the hallway, the flickering lights. But the voice was louder now, clearer. It was no longer just a whisper in my mind. It was here, in this world. And I realized then that it wasn't just a dream. The dream had been the first step, the invitation, and now, the world I had entered was real. And it was waiting for me. Asterisk, it's time to wake up, asterisk, the voice said, and I couldn't tell anymore whether I was still dreaming, or if I had truly awoken. It was the sound of the alarm that woke me, loud and insistent, its shrill ringing cutting through the haze of my sleep. The room was dark, the only light coming from the soft glow of the digital clock by my bedside, flashing the time as though it had been waiting for me to stir. I groaned, reaching out to silence the alarm, the weight of exhaustion still pressing against my body, reluctant to leave the warmth of the bed. The clock blinked again, 7:32 a.m. I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear the fog of sleep, and pulled myself up, still heavy with drowsiness. I glanced around the room, familiar and unchanged. The same books stacked on the desk, the same soft carpet beneath my feet, the same curtains drawn tight against the morning light. Everything felt ordinary. Nothing was out of place. I pushed myself out of bed, stretching, yawning, and then padded to the window to open the blinds. I was expecting the usual view of the city, traffic already starting to crawl down the street, people rushing to work, the usual buzz of a weekday morning. But when I pulled the blinds open, I froze. The world outside was empty. I blinked, unsure if it was some trick of my tired eyes, but when I looked again, nothing had changed. The street was completely still. No cars, no people walking by, no movement at all. The buildings across the street were as familiar as they had always been, the same ones I saw every morning from my window. But the streets between them were bare, not a soul in sight. The distant hum of the city I had grown used to was absent. It was as though the world had been paused, frozen in time. I stepped back from the window, my heart beginning to race. This wasn't right. This was not how things were supposed to be. I had woken up, hadn't I? The alarm had gone off, I had heard it, I had gotten up like I always did. But now, the city outside didn't exist anymore. I moved to the door, opening it slowly, hesitant to step into the quiet. The hallway outside was just as empty, as still as the street I had just looked out on. My footsteps echoed unnervingly in the silence as I walked down the hallway to the stairs. I reached the landing and glanced down into the lobby of the building. No receptionist behind the desk. No mail on the counter. Just emptiness, like no one had stepped foot in here for hours, maybe even days. My pulse quickened as I stepped out into the street, the door of the building clicking shut behind me. The air felt thick, heavy with the absence of sound. I looked up and down the street, scanning for any signs of life, but there was nothing. The sidewalks were deserted. The usual hum of the city's morning rush had vanished. The stores that usually lined the street were closed, the windows dark. Even the streetlights, which normally flickered on in the early morning light, stood still, lifeless. I walked forward slowly, my shoes tapping against the pavement in the unsettling silence. My heart was thudding now, an unease creeping into my chest. It felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. I passed by familiar stores, ones I visited every day, but they were closed, the shutters pulled down, their signs dark and untouched. The coffee shop I went to on my way to work was locked, the door shut tight. I tried the handle, but it didn't budge. It was as though the whole city had been abandoned, left to sit in stillness, frozen in place. I turned the corner, hoping to find something that would make sense of this, some sign, some explanation, but the street continued to stretch out in front of me, empty and silent. I walked for what felt like hours, my legs growing heavier, my mind racing. The city was a shell of itself, the places I had known for years now unrecognizable in their emptiness. I stopped by a bench in the park, trying to calm myself, trying to understand what had happened. The trees were still, their leaves barely rustling in the faint breeze. The air felt dead. The sounds of birds or distant cars were absent. It was as if the world had been erased, as if everything that once made it alive had simply stopped. I tried calling someone, anyone, just to hear a voice, but the line was dead. No signal. No connection. The world was isolated, cut off, and I couldn't understand why. I sat there for a long while, the silence pressing in on me, my mind spinning in circles. The city I knew, the city that had once been full of life, was gone. The buildings were still there, the streets were still there, but the life, the energy, the movement, was completely absent. I stood up, feeling the weight of it all, the loneliness of it. It felt like I was the last person left, like I had woken up in a world that had already moved on without me. The people, the sounds, the rush of life, it was all gone, and I was left in its place, standing in the middle of a city that had ceased to exist. As I walked back down the street, toward my apartment, I felt the heavy weight of the absence follow me. No cars passed me. No one walked by. I couldn't see anyone. I couldn't hear anyone. It was just me, alone in the middle of a city that was silent. And then, as I reached my building and opened the door to go back inside, I caught a glimpse of myself in the reflection of the glass. My face was pale, my eyes wide with confusion and fear. But it wasn't the look of someone who had just woken up. It was the look of someone who had been left behind.